Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Scott DeLoach, and I will be discussing microcontent. So I'd like to start with an overview of microcontent. Just, you may be unfamiliar with the term, so I'll explain what I mean by microcontent. Well, I'd also like to talk about why it's important, why it might be interesting to you. And then we'll get into some examples. I'll share how you can create microcontent. There are a few different options. And I will close with some best practices. So first of all, let's start at the beginning. What is microcontent? What is it? Why should I care about it? Well, a lot of people assume that microcontent is this new idea or a new term, and it's not really. The term microcontent can kind of trace itself back to about 1998, Jacob Nielsen. It's expanded since then, but in 1998, he used this term to describe a really short abstract of a larger block of content. And that is still a very common use of microcontent to sort of summarize, to help the user decide, do I need to finish reading this? And a classic example, an example that Jacob Nielsen even used, is the idea of an abstract for, say, a research paper. You don't have time to read hundreds of research papers, so you read those abstracts and then you pick out, okay, I need to delve into this one and this one, or maybe this one doesn't apply to me. Why is that important? Why do we care about that? Well, the whole idea of microcontent is bundling up this standalone block of content because people do have short attention spans. We don't have time to read all the information out there. There's too much information. If you see statistics about how much content is added, say, every second to the web, nobody has time to read all that. So we need filtering mechanisms, and we're going to need even more in the future. So microcontent helps us filter down and focus our information. It can summarize. It can entice users to read more. And the part that's most exciting to me is microcontent gives us this option to make these bundles of content that can be reused and they can be curated. So thinking about the content you might develop now, well, probably right now, you and your team are developing most, if not all, of your content yourself. Well, what if you could pick and choose and pull in content developed by anyone? So if you thought, hey, we need a really good description of this. Ooh, there's already a fantastic description of this. I can reuse it. I can kind of put that block in right here. That's something we see a lot with the concept of SCORM on the training side of things. This idea of I want to have reusable blocks of content. Microcontent gives us that sort of in a tech writing perspective and a lot of other situations too. So how can you reuse microcontent? All right, I can give you a couple of examples. Microcontent could be reused for embedded user assistance. Take the idea of, hey, I have a frequently asked questions topic. But this question would be really useful if it were right there in the application. We could pull that question dynamically out of a help topic using microcontent and reuse in the application as embedded user assistance. It could be used for context-sensitive help. Similar idea, maybe a pop-up describing something. It can be used by chatbots, and now we're really getting out of our typical realm. Someone is typing in a question. The chatbot system can match that up to an existing answer and pull that content out and show it as the chatbot's response. It could be used in artificial reality or augmented reality, virtual reality systems. Now, these things I'm describing when I'm using the word could, I'm using the word could from a perspective of you could do this. This is already being done. Many people are doing it, but I'm saying you could do it with your content. And I saved the one that's most exciting to me for last, voice-based search. Imagine, I won't say her name, it's Alex with an A at the end, but imagine if you could say, Alex A, what is X? And she could pull out the response from content you've written. and say that. I think that would be amazing as a tech writer if next time someone asks me, hey, what do you do? And my typical response, I start telling them, and they think, that's not that interesting. It's not as exciting as architect or doctor. I think it's exciting, but maybe they don't. Imagine you can do that. You say, oh, let me show you. And you say, hey, computer, or Alex, hey, or Siri. And when she responds, or he responds, that, I do that. That would be amazing. It would be a game changer for us. And we can do all these things. And it would, not only would it be cool, it would be super useful. So some examples. All right, well, the most common example right now of microcontent is using it as part of search results. Okay, and you see this in help systems. I'm going to use an example of Madcap Flare. You see this in Adobe RoboHelp as well. Both of those tools let you create blocks of microcontent. And as part of those tools, when you build your outputs, your targets, your layouts, if someone's search question matches a microcontent block, it can show it at the top of the results. So we'll look at an example. But some other examples. As I'm describing that in a help system, you might be thinking, I see that in Google all the time. Yeah. Google's results too. They have some different names for them. So there's a general name and then pieces of it have different names. But it's often described as a featured snippet. So think about searching in Google, and at the top of the search results, there's hopefully the answer to your question. That's also microcontent. Okay, so how do we do that? How can we maybe make our own self-contained system that shows microcontent blocks in the search results? Or even more powerful, how could we develop microcontent so that Google can mine our microcontent blocks and use it in Google search results? That requires using these structured data types that Google's identified. But we'll look at it. So first of all, what about our own self-contained help system, knowledge base, or whatever? I'm going to show you an example from the Madcap Flare help. This does not mean you have to use Flare to create it. As I mentioned, you could use RoboHelp or many other tools. That's just two examples. You could create microcontent blocks using Notepad if you wanted to. I'm just mentioning this to show you that it is built into tools already, and it's being built into more and more tools because this is such a game changer, really, for our field. So looking at this one example in the Flare help. So here's the Flare help. I searched for the word images. Okay, and in the search results here at the top is a microcontent block. So the Flare help team wrote this microcontent block, grouped it together as a microcontent block as the response to say, okay, if someone searches for images, show this. Now, more traditionally, the thing you search for, the search question, is often matched to a question. Is something you might be wondering is, well, you just search for images, it's kind of generic. Well, that's also why we have a very generic answer here. But microcontent can be very focused. So as an example, you could write as your question and response, or prompt and response, there's a couple of different terms for this. It can be very specific questions such as, which image formats can I use? Or which image formats work best for the web? So different questions about images could have different responses. It doesn't have to be so broad. And that's where it really has power tying into things like a chatbot or like a voice-activated search that I mentioned. But just taking this high-level, more generic one. In this response, because it's a very generic question, we get a very large microcontent block. But what this is showing you, whether you're using any tool, is a microcontent block can have any type of content in it. This one has a picture, a bulleted list, a table, a paragraph. It doesn't have to have all those things. It might only be text. It might only be a video or a picture. It's up to you, whatever the best response or answer to the user's need is. And I think partly in this example, and you see this in RoboHelp and the other tools that have it built in, often in their help systems, when they're showing you the feature, they intentionally put in everything just to remind you, hey, you can have these things. So this isn't necessarily a best practice of writing microcontent, because it's intentionally showing you it can have a table, lots of links, a picture, not to say that you should have all those things. It's a little large. So that's one example here in the Player Help. Now, what about Google? Google has been working on microcontent for years. They have an enormous head start. So if this is a new concept to you and you're thinking, well, this sounds like it might be useful to me, Google is obsessed with this. And people are actively using it. You may not realize, oh, that's called microcontent, or all this is behind it, because they've made it so transparent. But if you think about Google now, a common example is, and I can even kind of live demo this. I live in Florida. So if I search for what is the capital, this is microcontent. This block here about Tallahassee, the capital of Florida, is a microcontent block. It has a map. It's showing their kind of motto, the flag of Florida, everything. So the idea with this microcontent is I don't have to look for my answer in the search results. I already have an answer. It's not only is it saving me a click, it's saving me time. I start feeling, wow, this search is incredibly useful. It's almost like it read my mind. It didn't really, but it feels like that because the answer's right there. Now, how is that happening? Well, what Google has done, because they're doing so much research on this, Google has identified sort of types of microcontent, and they call them structured data types. And I think the ones that overlap with what we do the most are an FAQ type, a Q&A type, and a how-to type. There are many types. Google has identified quite a few, let's say 30. But really what Google is doing is they're picking from an even larger set of types that have been identified. So Google has picked out types that they feel tie into search. And I filtered that down to the 3 that I feel overlap a lot with our content. But if you want to look at all the types are coming from, as we'll talk about, schema.org. And there are hundreds of types. The recipe is the type, for example. I'm going to show you that in a second. So out of those hundreds of types, Google has picked the ones they feel like they're going to get the most value out of, and they focus on those. But we could start, I think, with these 3 and really get a lot of benefit just from that. So let's delve into these 3. Okay, so an example of an FAQ. Google defines FAQ and Schema defines an FAQ as it's question and answers, but one group, entity, organization, person is in charge of kind of creating the questions and the answers. The questions may be submitted, but I can't go to the site and type in a question and add one. And I can't go to the site as sort of the outside of the owner and answer it. So someone is both responsible for creating the questions and the answers all on their own. So this is Google's example. I'm intentionally using theirs. The actual page is written as a typical heading answer. Heading with the question, answer, heading, answer, heading, answer. But Google not only can pull and mine that content, they reformat it using drop-downs. So if you have structured your data as an FAQ, Google can find it, process it. You have to tell it it's an FAQ. And when someone's question matches your answers, even dynamically reformatted as drop-downs. All this is happening now live. And this ties in so much to what we should be doing. I think we should be owning all this. And we can at least start doing it. So how about a Q&A? The Q&A is more open. So typically anyone can post a question and people can provide answers. So it may be moderated, but someone doesn't have complete control over it. So if you identify a page as a question and answer page, if someone's search matches one of those questions, it can show the answers, and even based on how you've tagged it, identify the top answer and even how many votes it got, because there's typically voting in Q&A sites, to tell the user, oh wow, this must, not only is this a top answer, it's a very popular answer, most likely this is the best answer. And all this formatting, again, dynamic. You don't have to format your content, the actual Q&A page like this. You tag it in such a way that Google can reformat it and represent it to best answer the user's question as part of a search results page. And then finally, the how-to. So a how-to, this is, I think, a fantastic example, how to tie a tie. So as an example, someone created a page describing how to tie a tie, breaking it into steps with pictures, tagged it as a how-to. If you search on Google for how to tie a tie, it can pull that content and present the pictures along with the steps to explain how to do that. Now, because this is a picture, of course, the live example, you can scroll through the pictures like a slideshow. I can't do that in this picture, but on Google's actual site, yes, there's a little arrow and you can click and go through all the steps and watch them. I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's nothing stopping you from having a video. Maybe a video that shows the whole process, maybe separate videos that describe each step. And the user, there are examples of this now on Google, and you can click and just watch. So maybe you're looking at step 2 and think, I don't understand that. You could watch just that video. Google has even gotten smart enough where a video, say on YouTube, can have markers in it, and it can dynamically pull out the content between the markers and split it up to break up the videos, or open the video directly to a marker. So those options are on the table as well. So how do we create microcontent? Well, if all you want to do is add microcontent to your self-contained search, like a help system or knowledge base, if microcontent is built into your tool, you can create microcontent blocks in your tool, then it should also be built into the tool's output search results. And that's the best place to start. If it's built into the tool, start there and have it in your self-contained search. But then eventually, you need to think about, if your content is accessible by Google, how Google can mine your content and add it to the Google search results. And Google is going to want you to either use JSON, Microdata, or RDFA. These work together with the data types, information types. That's specified by schema. So schema has hundreds of types. Google takes those types, picked out the ones that seem most useful in search results, really narrowed it down from hundreds to about 30 right now. But JSON, Microdata, and RDFA are kind of the syntax of how you have to specify the properties and the values for this to work. So you have to pick one of these in combination with a data type. I highly recommend JSON. Google also recommends JSON, but the other ones will work, but you're going to want to use JSON. How do we set it up? If you're using a tool, it's going to be pretty easy to make a microcontent block. This just to show you how easy it is. So in Flare, you just make a microcontent file, type in the phrase, like in my previous example, images, or which image formats are supported. I recommend phrasing as a question, but again, that's optional. And then the response is the content that will appear. So it is typically called a phrase and response, or prompt and response, or heading and content, if you want to describe it like that. The encoding, the syntax. So here's an example. This is a real example. You still have your content as normal HTML. In addition to that, you have to add this JSON. Not necessarily that fun, but it's not horrible to read. It's based on, the J is JavaScript, so it's based on JavaScript notation and syntax. So this is an example, a JSON example. This is what Google's going to actually mine. So in your topic, you would have this section in addition to your HTML content. Google will check to make sure they match. So you can't trick it and say write the JSON and then have totally different content display. They verify that the JSON code matches what's in the HTML. Right, so there's JSON example. Microdata. Microdata and RDFA are a lot easier, at least to me, a lot easier to read if you're more comfortable with HTML because it's kind of blended in together. With JSON, you have a JSON section, HTML section. But here in microdata, you can see it's basically using this item prop attribute with different values to identify. So it's all blended in. If we compare that to RDFA, also blended in, it's just really the main difference is it uses a property attribute instead of item prop. I think you're going to be tempted. I'm certainly tempted. I look at this and think, I could probably write some kind of script or something to add this. I have written scripts to add microdata. I've written scripts to create JSON too. But comparing them, it would be easier to write something that could kind of put this in than writing the JSON scripting. But again, I'm going to recommend the JSON because that's the direction the world's going in. I think very soon our tools are going to be able to somehow create this for us. Right now, we have to do it pretty much manually. There's a little bit of automation you can put in. But I can see tools very soon. You could identify the block and it could take your HTML and make JSON code out of it. But we're not there yet. All right, and we're going to wrap up with some best practices. So from a design standpoint, best practices. I mentioned this before, and I really want to stress it. Keep an eye on the data types that Google is adding into their search, because they're the leaders. They're the ones setting the examples. They're the ones setting the user expectation. Right now, I'm really focused on FAQ, Q&A, and how-to. I think that they will create kind of a summary or concept, maybe a troubleshooting data type. Now, these exist in Schema, but maybe they'll start supporting them and integrating that into their search, and then I'll start using those as well. But we have to keep an eye on it just because they're the gorilla in the room, and they're the boss. You want to keep it simple. Remember that other things are going to reformat our content and rearrange it and do things to it. Plus, we have to encode it in JSON. So don't make your life more difficult by writing really complex HTML or really complex structure. So keep it simple. Use a heading tag, most likely H1 or H2 for the question, the prompt. Usually the response, often it's just a paragraph, a P tag. That's it. Nothing wrong with having a list, but we're not talking about really complex HTML tagging here. Definitely use images and videos if they make the response more valuable. There's nothing wrong with that, or certainly a bulleted list or numbered list. That's fine. From a writing perspective, I've been talking about Google, but yes, of course, there's other search engines. Keep an eye on them. What I do when I'm writing my content, I don't care how technical the content is. So, and maybe you've fallen into this trap. It's very easy to fall into this. I work with groups all the time, and I ask them, what are people searching for? And it's like nobody's searching on Google for our product. It's so technical, and comparatively, we don't have that many users. You'll be surprised. the last group I was working with, I was asking them, hey, are there videos on YouTube about this feature? And no, of course not. We never made them. That doesn't mean they're not out there. And we searched and we found lots of videos that users had made about very technical parts of the product. So before you just assume it's not out there, no one's searching, search. I bet you're going to get responses. What are the responses? Are they correct? Are they well done? Are there ideas you can get from that, from your writing? Is there content that's missing? But just to let you check out other search engines, Quora, Yahoo Answers, Answer the Public especially is fascinating in how graphical it shows questions and responses. It's a really neat site if you haven't checked it out. So check out these sites to get ideas. I really like to write really descriptive question-based prompts like how to or how do I, what is. Taking the images as an example, if someone searched for where can I insert an image, it doesn't have to completely match. The fact that it has, if I only have one microcontent block about images, that will be the match. But if I have multiple microcontent blocks about images, one is explaining, say, procedures of how to insert an image, one is where can I insert an image, and one is why should I insert an image. If I've written my questions with those, with why, how, where, and the user includes those words along with image, then they will match. It's going to help with the matching. That's why you want to write a really descriptive question or prompt. Keep it short. Remember that this content is going to be pulled and reused and possibly reformatted. The whole idea of this is this very focused information. So they're relatively short. I said 50 words here just as a ballpark. I'm not saying they have to be that short, but you're not writing a whole topic. This is not a whole topic. It's a very, very focused block of content to answer a specific question. It's much better to have many microcontent blocks than one big one. And the reuse. I'll recommend it again. Use JSON. Even though it's probably the hardest one to create, it's the most flexible, the most powerful, and it's the one Google likes. So that's going to be the winner, I think, out of this three-way fight. What I've been doing now and what I recommend to you, the whole concept of microcontent has totally changed how I write content now. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest impacts on our field. When I start a new project, I write the microcontent blocks first now. I write all my microcontent, look at it, and then it's almost like building my topics with the microcontent. So I'll say, okay, I need to have a topic about this. Okay, I'm going to reuse this microcontent block, reuse this microcontent block, add this to the topic. So I usually have one or two or more blocks of microcontent in my topics. But that, again, that's totally changed our writing style. And I think we're going to go in this direction, because if you think about why do we start topic-based authoring? Because originally we were writing system-based content or whole documents. We were doing document-based authoring, if you want to call it that. And we realized no one wants to look through the whole document or read the whole document to answer their question. So let's break it into self-contained topics. This is the next step in that progression. This is going to happen and is happening and will continue to happen. We're going to write these blocks first because that's how people access the content, through the search. That's going to be the first thing they see. The topic to them is going to be the additional information they get after their question was answered, if they want additional information. So we need to go ahead and start writing for that initial point of use, which is going to be microcontent blocks, not a whole topic. And then finally, for the reuse, keep the tagging simple, keep the formatting simple, because it's going to be repurposed, possibly retagged, and almost always restyled. So you have to keep that simple so that it has the maximum flexibility for reuse. If you have a question about microcontent, I am very passionate about it. I would love to talk to you about microcontent. You're more than welcome to email me. So let me know if you have any questions or you want to bounce an idea off of someone. Reach out through LinkedIn, or here's my email address. Thank you for attending my session. I hope it's been interesting to you. I hope you're as excited about microcontent as me. And Thank you for letting me participate in the conference. All right. Bye.
Awesome. Well, look, thanks so much for joining us for the Q&A, Scott. It's great to have you here. Thanks for telling us all about micro-content. It was actually good from my perspective. I got a little bit confused, I think, from the difference between micro-copy and micro-content. And there's definitely an important difference there, isn't there?
Yeah, it's unfortunate they have similar names. But yeah, they're pretty different.
Yeah, well, look, I know you've been great in actually you're live answering some of the questions in the chat. But I think what we'll do is we'll go through some of the questions that you've already answered in the chat, just so we get them in recording. We might be able to expand on them a little bit too in the session too. So I might start with a question from Karthik here, who asks, is microcontent effective for internal site search results?
Right now, a lot of search engines don't support microcontent. And usually when they add it, it's usually with like a glossary or something. So you see that sometimes. So if you have a glossary just with a term and a definition, then it'll start matching those. But you can't add other types of microcontent, and sometimes it's just text. So that's something to watch for. If you notice, hey, the search engine supports these glossary results and they're at the top, then they're obviously working towards other types of microcontent, but that seems to be the doorway to get in there. So not all of them support it, but an interesting thing about it is often it's a high-level match to what someone searched for. So often if it's not called out at the top and formatted differently, it's the first result. So it's still supported in that way as a result, like anything else.
Yeah, right. It does make sense. So another question we've got here is, how should you actually tag the content for Google to recognize it as micro content? Are there keywords or anything that you need to apply when you're structuring it?
Yeah, there's a couple of things, and keywords are certainly something to think about. There are a whole bunch of schemas that's defined at schema.org, a bunch, like hundreds. But Google kind of picked out the ones they think are probably most valuable to, to search results into their business. And they have about, say, 30, but they're constantly growing. I can remember when they had 10. So we'll see more of them. I doubt they'll ever support all of them, all 650 or so that are in there. But that's part of it. You have to kind of align with one of those, is what I would call it. Let's say a how-to or a summary or something like that. If Google doesn't support it, they're going to ignore it. So it has to align with the schema. And then it has to be coded in one of the 3 supported methods. And I recommend, I'm going to call it JSON. I recommend using JSON. They support 3, but they heavily prefer JSON. And I think eventually they're just going to say, hey, that's all we want. So there's quite a bit of coding involved. But yes, as far as from the user's perspective, it has to match a question. So you have to think about the user's query. You identify that and say, hey, this is the answer to that query. So there's still a big part of tech writing and thinking of, okay, this is the best answer to this question. But then behind the scenes, there's additional code. And we have
Sounds like you really need to put yourself into the seat of the user and try and put your, what would I want to ask when I'm actually trying to get a result for this question?
Absolutely. That's how I do it. Because the cool thing about it is when it actually matches their question, it's almost like, oh, wow, it read my mind. And it really impresses people when it does pop up. So you get a big bang for your buck. If you spend the time and think about their questions and you get it right, they think, wow, this is great. This is so much better than without it. They really appreciate
like you're reading their mind without them even knowing it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This might actually be a bit of a follow-on question, actually, about tagging content. So what happens if you've got a big sort of blob or block of content and you want to actually make that accessible for micro content and for search engines? How do you actually structure the larger bits of information, or is it really just you have to think more atomically and break things down a bit more?
Well, I mentioned just a little bit in the presentation. What I am doing now is I'm writing the small blocks first, the micro content blocks first. And I'm thinking almost with a question and answer approach. I think the user's going to have this question. Here's a good answer. I think they're going to have this question. Here's a good answer. And then I kind of gather all those up together and say, well, these all kind of go together and they kind of turn into a topic. So I'm writing at that more atomic level now than I used to. Just like I think we went from writing at a kind of book approach to topic based. I think this is as big a jump. Now we're going to jump to writing the micro content because that's the first way they access it. They're going to access these little blocks first and then eventually go into the bigger blocks, which are now our topics. So I think that's a good way to think about it. Atomic is a good term.
Yeah, atomic. That sounds really interesting. So it's sort of like you're starting with the smallest unit first, and then where you're seeing gaps in the content, maybe putting some supportive documentation around those key bits of micro content.
Totally. Yeah, that's a great way to think of it. And we don't usually have the luxury. Probably most people are thinking, I already have a lot of content. I mean, that's great if I'm starting from scratch. I'm not starting from scratch. I got a whole bunch of stuff. Well, you can still look at your current topics and kind of think of them from that question and answer perspective. And you might look at a topic and think, ooh, this answers these 5 questions. Hey, this could be 5 blocks of micro content. So you can mine them from existing content. I mean, that's kind of what Google's doing now. They're mining content that exists on the web and turning it into micro content. They're dynamically doing that. And if you identify your content, then they will mine your content. But we can do that ourselves.
That's right. We essentially make it easier for Google to find the information from our content and service it more readily. So we're letting making it easier for the robots, essentially, right?
Yep, that's exactly what we're doing. It's going to change. I don't think we're going to have to code it in the future, but yeah, right now we're doing the hard part. It seems like that should be automated. Kind of the robots should be doing that, but we're having to do it now.
Yeah, the future looks bright. It's good. So
it does.
So is there actually I guess a schema definition or of like a glossary entry? Is there some sort of standard that exists for that type of thing? Where can you find out more information about that sort of thing?
It's at schema.org, and all of them are out there, and they do add new ones, but there's, like I said, at least 600. It's like 600, 850. There's a whole bunch of them. Now, some of them are really esoteric, and you'll think, when would I ever use that? But everything you could think of is out there. So there's a schema for everything already. And I would say go ahead and follow the schema, because whatever Google adds, they're going to add it based on the schema. So you might as well follow it and you'll be ahead of the game.
Yeah, that's fair enough as well. Make it easier. So we touched on, I admitted before that, I was a little bit confused about the difference between microcopy and micro content. Do you think you might be able to sort of, for the folks out there, explain a little bit more about the differences between those two discrete things?
Sure. Copy, the way it was typically defined, would be just the blocks of text that might be in a user interface. And a lot of those, depends on your line, a lot of the content in an application, in a UI, is instructional. So in my opinion, I typically, old school, would call it embedded user assistance. But that's included in microcontent. So even our copy is a gray area where someone that's a UI designer might say, hey, I do that, and that's microcopy. And we look at it and say, no, I do that because it's instructional. So we fight over part of it. But kind of any of the words is a way to think of it in a UI would be microcopy. Now, some of that, especially the instructional part, could also be microcontent because it might be reused. For example, what if there's something that says, for a password, here's a good password, a little sentence that helps you. You might reuse that in a topic, and that might be something that's also microcopy content. So when someone searches in Google, what's a good password, that shows up. So it could be used in a whole bunch of places and be categorized as any.
So there's overlap. Well, you know what? This has been really interesting to talk more about microcontent with you. There's been some great questions answered. So thanks, folks, for all your really well thought out questions that you've asked. But unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up the session for now and get ready for the next one. So I just want to say thank you so much, Scott, for your presentation and making yourself available for your question and answers today. And enjoy the rest of the conference.
Great, and thanks for moderating.
No worries at all. Happy